My son told me to transfer $750,000 for my own safety. Then, he made me disappear. The words hung in the air of my small Chicago apartment like a confession I never thought I'd make. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep finding the courage to share these truths. My name is Helen Margaret O'Brien, and at 78 years old, I've learned that the people who promise to protect you can become the very ones who destroy you. But this isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when the child you raised with bleeding hands looks at you and sees nothing but dollar signs. The morning it all began, I was standing in my kitchen on Maple Street, the same kitchen where I'd made Daniel's school lunches for 12 years after his father died. The October sun streamed through the lace curtains I'd sewn myself in 1987, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum that I'd scrubbed on my hands and knees countless times. The smell of coffee, the cheap kind I'd learned to love during those lean years, filled the air as I waited for my son's call. Daniel always called on Tuesdays. It was our tradition, started when he moved to the suburbs with Alicia. "Just checking in, Mom," he'd say. And for those few minutes, I felt like I mattered to someone. But this Tuesday was different. "Mom, we need to talk." Daniel's voice came through the phone with an urgency that made my chest tighten. Gone was the warmth, the casual, "How are you feeling?" that usually started our conversations. Instead, there was something rehearsed, something cold that I'd never heard before. I set down my coffee cup, the one with the faded Chicago Bears logo that Daniel had given me for Mother's Day 15 years ago, and felt my hands begin to tremble. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Nothing's wrong. That's not—" "Look, Alicia and I have been talking. We're worried about you." "Worried about me?" I glanced around my spotless kitchen, at the neat stack of bills I'd just finished paying, at the grocery list I'd written in my careful handwriting. What was there to worry about? With all the crime these days, Mom, and cyber criminals targeting seniors, it's just not safe for you to be managing that much money alone. What if someone scams you? What if something happens to you? That much money. $750,000. Every cent earned through 43 years of double shifts at Murphy's Diner on Western Avenue, weekend jobs cleaning offices downtown, and nights spent mending clothes by lamplight because new ones were a luxury I couldn't afford. Money saved quarter by quarter, dollar by dollar, through years when choosing between heating and groceries was a monthly decision. "I've managed just fine for 78 years, Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But something in his tone made me feel like a child being scolded. "That's just it, Mom. You're 78. Things change. Memory changes. And Alicia, well, she's got experience with financial planning. She thinks it would be safer if we moved your money into a joint account. We'll manage it for you. Take that stress off your shoulders." Alicia, my daughter-in-law who called me Helen with the same tone she used for the mailman, who smiled with her teeth but never her eyes, who had somehow convinced my son that his 78-year-old mother was suddenly incompetent. "I don't understand," I whispered, sinking into the kitchen chair where I'd sat every morning for 23 years. "My mind is sharp. I pay my bills on time. I've never been scammed." "Mom, please. This isn't about your capabilities. It's about protecting what Dad would have wanted protected. Think of it as insurance. We'll handle everything. You won't have to worry about anything anymore. Won't have to worry." As if worry was the problem, and not the fact that my only child was asking me to hand over my life savings. The only thing standing between me and complete dependence. I closed my eyes and saw myself at 42, standing in the Social Security office after Robert's funeral, Daniel's small hand in mine, both of us still in our funeral clothes. The caseworker had looked at me with pity and said, "You'll need to be very careful with money now, Mrs. O'Brien. There won't be much coming in." I'd made a promise that day, to Robert's memory and to my 6-year-old son. I would never be a burden. I would never be helpless. I would save every penny I could so that when I got old, I could take care of myself. And now that little boy, grown into a 45-year-old man with a mortgage and a wife who drove a BMW, was asking me to break that promise. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "can I think about it?" there was a pause. A long pause that felt like judgment. Of course, Mom. But don't think too long. The longer you wait, the more vulnerable you are. We're coming over tonight to discuss it properly. Alicia's bringing some documents for you to look at. The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen surrounded by 40 years of careful living. The mended curtains, the hand-me-down furniture I'd polished until it gleamed, the ceramic salt and pepper shakers Daniel had made in third-grade art class. Everything in this room told the story of a woman who had taken care of herself, who had been strong when strength was all she had. But as I looked at my reflection in the black screen of my phone, I saw something that terrified me. An old woman, not Helen O'Brien, who had worked 3 jobs to put her son through college. Not the woman who had single-handedly managed her finances for 4 decades. Just an old woman whose own son thought she was too fragile to handle her own money. I picked up the framed photo from the counter. Daniel at his college graduation, his arm around me, both of us beaming with pride. I remembered that day so clearly, how he'd whispered in my ear, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom. Everything I achieve is because of your sacrifice." Now, as I stared at that photo, I wondered, was I about to make the biggest mistake of my life? Or had I already made it by trusting that the boy I'd raised would always see me as more than just an inconvenience to be managed? The grandfather clock in the hallway, another thrift store find I'd restored myself, chimed noon, and I realized I'd been sitting there for over an hour, holding that photo, feeling something I'd never felt before in my own home, afraid. That night, when Daniel and Alicia arrived with their folder full of documents and their practiced smiles, I would make a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, sitting in my kitchen with the afternoon light fading, I still believed that love would protect me. I still believed that being someone's mother meant something. I had no idea that I was about to discover just how wrong I was. That evening, as I waited for Daniel and Alicia to arrive, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old shoebox I kept in my bedroom closet, the one filled with memories I'd carefully preserved through 4 decades of single motherhood. My hand shook as I lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of lavender sachets I'd tucked inside to keep everything fresh. There, on top, was Daniel's first-grade report card. Mrs. Patterson had written in careful cursive, "Daniel is a bright boy, but he seems tired in class. Is everything all right at home?" I remembered that conference like it was yesterday, sitting in that tiny plastic chair, my work uniform still smelling of coffee and grease from the diner, trying to explain to this well-dressed teacher why my 6-year-old was falling asleep during story time. "I work the night shift," I'd whispered, ashamed. "Sometimes he waits up for me to come home." Mrs. Patterson's face had softened. "Mrs. O'Brien, you're doing the best you can, but Daniel needs stability. He needs to know you'll be there." That night, I'd made a decision that would define the next 17 years of my life. I quit the night shift at the diner, the one that paid time and a half, and took on 3-day jobs instead. I cleaned offices before dawn, worked the lunch shift at Murphy's Diner, and spent evenings alterating clothes for neighbors. Less money, but more time with Daniel. I pulled out another memory, a crumpled piece of paper with crayon marks. Daniel's drawing from 2nd grade. 2 stick figures holding hands under a sun with an enormous smile. "Me and Mommy," he'd written at the bottom, the Y backwards. On the back, in my own handwriting, I'd noted, "Rent, $340. Groceries, $67. Daniel's new shoes, $23. Total left, $12. $12. That's what we'd lived on for the rest of that month. I'd watered down the milk and told Daniel it was a new kind. I'd made soup from bones the butcher gave me for free and called it Adventure Stew. And when Daniel asked why we couldn't go to McDonald's like other kids, I'd said, "We're saving money for something special." The something special was always his future, always his education, always making sure he'd never have to choose between rent and groceries. I found the bank statements I'd kept from those early years, evidence of miracles performed with pocket change. Somehow, even earning barely above minimum wage, I'd managed to save $5 here, $10 there, sometimes just the coins from my tip jar. I'd open a Christmas Club account every January and pretend the money didn't exist until December, when it would buy Daniel's presents and winter coat. By the time he was 10, I was saving $50 a month. By 15, it was $100. When he graduated high school, I had enough to pay for his first year of college without loans. He'd hugged me so tight that day, tears in his eyes. "Mom, how did you do it? How did you save so much on what you make?" "Love finds a way," I'd told him. It was the closest I'd ever come to admitting that I'd been living on rice and beans for months to make his dreams possible. The doorbell rang, interrupting my trip through the past. I carefully placed the memories back in the shoebox, but kept one item out: a photograph of Daniel's college graduation. In it, he's wearing the cap and gown I'd paid for with money earned from 6 months of working Christmas Eve shifts. His arm is around my shoulders, and his smile is so genuine, so full of gratitude. I carried that photo with me to the living room, where Daniel and Alicia were settling onto my couch like they owned it. Alicia had dressed for the occasion, a crisp blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and those sharp heels that clicked across my hardwood floors like a countdown timer. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, and when she smiled at me, it was the kind of smile you'd give a troublesome child. "Helen," she said, setting a leather portfolio on my coffee table with the authority of someone conducting a business meeting. "We've prepared everything you need to see: bank statements, investment options, security measures. This is really going to give you such peace of mind." Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. He sat forward, hands clasped, looking everywhere but at me. "Mom, we've already talked to the bank. They said transfers like this happen all the time. Families helping families. It's actually the responsible thing to do." I looked down at the photograph in my lap, that moment of pure joy and gratitude on his graduation day. "Daniel," I said softly, "do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted that bicycle for your birthday?" His head snapped up, confusion flickering across his face. "Mom, what does that have to do with the red Schwinn? All your friends had bikes and you felt left out. You never asked for it directly, but I saw how you looked at them through the store window every time we walked past Woolworths." Alicia shifted impatiently, her heel tapping against my floor. "Helen, we really should focus on the financial matters. I worked double shifts for 3 months to buy that bike," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I told you it was from your father watching from heaven, because I didn't want you to know that your mother was taking extra work just to give you something every other kid had." Daniel's face went pale. "Mom, you rode that bike everywhere. You took such good care of it. And when you outgrew it, you asked if we could donate it to the church so another kid could have the same joy you did." I held up the graduation photo. "This is the boy I remember. The one who understood sacrifice. The one who appreciated what love could accomplish with very little money." "That's exactly why we're here," Alicia interjected, her voice taking on an edge. "You've sacrificed enough, Helen. It's time to let us take care of you." "By taking my money?" "By managing your money," Daniel said quickly. "Mom, you've always been so responsible. But things are different now. Online banking, cryptocurrency scams, identity theft. It's not the same world where you could just write checks and balance a checkbook." I thought about my neat records, filed by month and year, my balanced accounts, my careful tracking of every expense. "I've never been scammed, Daniel. Never missed a payment. Never bounced a check. Yet," Alicia said, and that single word hit like a slap. "You haven't been scammed yet. But Mom, can I call you Mom? You're at the age where these things happen. And once they do, the money's gone forever. The age where these things happen." As if reaching 78 had automatically erased my decades of financial responsibility. "What about when I turned 65? I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Or 70? Or 75? Was I suddenly incompetent then too? Or is this a new development?" Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was caught in a lie. "It's not about incompetence, Mom. It's about protection. About making sure you're secure. I am secure. I have my savings, my pension, my routine. I know exactly how much I spend each month, what I can afford, what I can't. I've been taking care of myself since your father died 40 years ago." "And you did an amazing job," Alicia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But that was then. This is now. And now, you have us to help you." The way she said help made my skin crawl. I'd heard that tone before, from the social worker who'd tried to convince me to put Daniel in foster care after Robert died. "You're young," she'd said. "You could start over. It might be better for both of you." I'd fought for my son then. I'd proven that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. But now, that same son was sitting in my living room, asking me to prove my love by giving up my independence. "Show me the documents," I said finally. Alicia's smile widened as she opened the portfolio. Inside were forms with legal language I didn't understand, but one thing was crystal clear. They wanted complete control, joint account with both their names, investment decisions made without my input, a monthly allowance that was a fraction of what I currently had access to. "This allowance," I said, pointing to the number, "this wouldn't even cover my current expenses." "That's because your current expenses are too high," Alicia replied matter-of-factly. "Helen, you're spending money on things you don't need. This budget will help you focus on necessities." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his wife that his mother wasn't wasteful or frivolous. Instead, he nodded. "She's right, Mom. You could save a lot by cutting back on unnecessary things. Unnecessary things. Like the $20 I spent monthly on flowers for my kitchen windowsill. The only beauty I allowed myself. Like the occasional lunch with my neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski. The only social interaction I had most weeks. Like the small donations I made to the church that had helped us when Daniel was young. "I need time to think," I said, closing the portfolio. "Of course," Daniel said, standing up. "But Mom, don't wait too long. The longer your money sits unprotected—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Something terrible would happen if I didn't surrender control immediately. After they left, I sat in my living room holding that graduation photo, remembering the boy who'd once told me I was his hero. Somewhere along the way, that hero had become a burden in his eyes. Was I wrong to want to keep what I'd worked so hard to earn? Was I being selfish by refusing to trust the child I'd given everything for? That night, I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of $20 bills flying away like birds, while a voice that sounded like Alicia's whispered, "She's not all there anymore." I woke up with a terrible certainty. This was just the beginning. 3 days later, I made the decision that would haunt me for months to come. I called Daniel and told him yes. The words felt like glass in my throat. "I'll sign the papers." "That's wonderful, Mom," he said. And for a moment, I heard an echo of the son I'd raised. "You're making the right choice. We'll take such good care of everything." The bank appointment was scheduled for the following Friday. I spent the week before it in a strange state of numbness, going through my daily routines while feeling like I was watching someone else's life. I watered my plants, paid what I knew would be my last bills, organized my financial records one final time, as if I were preparing for my own funeral. On Thursday night, I called Mrs. Kowalski, my neighbor of 15 years. Sarah Kowalski was 82, sharp as a tack, and the only person who still treated me like Helen O'Brien instead of Daniel's elderly mother. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I'm doing something tomorrow that doesn't feel right, but I don't know how to say no anymore." "Oh, honey," she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "What's happening?" I told her everything, about the phone call, the pressure, the documents I didn't understand. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Helen," she said finally, "you know I love you like a sister. So I'm going to tell you something your sister would tell you. This is wrong, dead wrong, but he's my son, and you're his mother, not his bank account." That night, I barely slept. But come morning, I was dressed in my best blue dress, the one I'd worn to Daniel's wedding, sitting in the passenger seat of his car, heading to First National Bank downtown. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, was a kind man in his 50s who'd handled my accounts for over a decade. He knew me, knew my habits, knew I paid every bill on time and never overdrew my account. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said as we settled into his office, "I have to ask, are you certain about this transfer? This is a significant amount of money, and once it's moved to a joint account—" "She's certain," Alicia interrupted before I could answer. "We've discussed this thoroughly as a family." Mr. Peterson looked at me directly. "Mrs. O'Brien, I need to hear from you personally." I opened my mouth to speak, and Daniel's hand found mine. His grip was gentle, but somehow it felt like a warning. "Tell him, Mom. Yes, I want to do this." The lie tasted bitter, but Mr. Peterson nodded and began processing the paperwork. I watched as $750,000, 40 years of my life, disappeared from my account with a few keystrokes. "The joint account is now active," he said, handing Daniel a set of new checks and a debit card. "Both of you will have full access. Both of us." But as I looked at the documents, I realized something that made my blood turn cold. While both our names were on the account, only Daniel's name was on the signature card for major transactions. I was listed as a secondary account holder. "What does this mean?" I asked, pointing to the fine print. "It means," Alicia said with that sharp smile, "that we can protect you from making any impulsive financial decisions, for your own good." The first sign that I'd made a terrible mistake came that very afternoon. I went to the grocery store, my usual Friday routine, and when I tried to use my debit card, it was declined. "Let me try running it again," the teenage cashier said, her voice sympathetic. Declined again. I stood there, my cart full of groceries, a line of people behind me, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. I'd never been unable to pay for groceries in my adult life. I'll have to come back," I mumbled, abandoning my cart and hurrying out of the store. At home, I called Daniel immediately. "Something's wrong with my card," I said. "It won't work." "Oh, that's right," he said, as if it were a minor detail he'd forgotten to mention. "We had to close your old account. We'll get you set up with a new card soon." "Soon?" "Daniel, I need groceries. I need to pay my utilities. Don't worry about any of that. We'll handle your bills now. And Alicia's going grocery shopping this weekend. She'll pick up whatever you need." Whatever I needed. Not what I wanted. What they decided I needed. What about cash? I usually keep some cash on hand for small expenses. There was a pause. "Mom, cash is exactly what we're trying to protect you from. Too easy to lose. Too easy for someone to steal from you. Everything will go through us now." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. In one day, I'd gone from financial independence to having no access to my own money. The weekend was a nightmare of small humiliations. When the paperboy came for his monthly collection, I had to ask Daniel for the $5 I owed. When my prescription was ready at the pharmacy, I had to wait for Alicia to drive me there and pay for it herself, while lecturing me about generic alternatives that would be more economical. "Helen," she said as we left the pharmacy, "you've been very wasteful with money. These name-brand medications, when generics work just as well, we're going to help you make smarter choices." Smarter choices. I'd been managing my medications for decades, working with my doctor to find what worked best for my arthritis and blood pressure. But now, my daughter-in-law, who'd never worked a day in healthcare, was making my medical decisions based on cost. Sunday evening, Daniel and Alicia came over with what they called good news. "We've been thinking," Daniel said, settling onto my couch like he was about to offer me a generous gift. "This house is getting too big for you, Mom. All these stairs, this old heating system, the maintenance costs. It's not practical." I looked around my living room, at the walls I'd painted myself, the floors I'd refinished with my own hands, the garden visible through the window that I'd tended for over 2 decades. "We think you should move in with us," Alicia added. "The guest room is perfect for you. Think of it. No more worrying about home repairs, no more heating bills, no more property taxes, no more independence, no more privacy, no more home. I love this house," I said quietly. "Your father and I saved for years to buy it." Daniel took his first steps in that hallway. "Mom," Daniel said, and his voice carried a note of impatience I'd never heard before. "You're being sentimental. This is about what makes financial sense." Financial sense. Everything in my life was now being reduced to what made financial sense to them. "What if I don't want to sell?" Alicia exchanged a look with Daniel. "Helen, you don't really have a choice. The house is expensive to maintain, and frankly, we can't afford to subsidize it along with all your other expenses." Subsidize. As if they were doing me a favor by managing the money I'd earned and saved. "But it's my house. I've been paying the mortgage for 23 years. "Mom," Daniel said gently, "the house payments come out of your account now. our account. And we've decided it's not a good investment anymore. Our account. My life savings had become their piggy bank, and my home had become their decision to make. That night, alone in my house for what I was beginning to understand might be the last time, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to understand how I'd gotten here. 3 weeks ago, I'd been Helen O'Brien. Independent, capable, secure. Now I was someone who had to ask permission to buy groceries, who couldn't pay for her own medications, who was being told where she could and couldn't live. I pulled out a pen and paper and tried to write down my feelings, the way my grief counselor had suggested after Robert died, but the words that came out were frightening. I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming a ghost in my own life. At the bottom of the page, I wrote something that shocked me with its clarity. Was I used? 3 simple words that changed everything, because once I asked that question, I couldn't stop asking it. Had Daniel called me every Tuesday because he loved me, or because he was keeping track of my mental state? Had he invited me to family dinners because he wanted my company, or because he was performing the role of a good son? Had he helped me with small repairs around the house because he cared, or because he was investing in the property he planned to sell? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that every interaction we'd had in recent years had somehow centered around my age, my capabilities, my finances. Never about my thoughts, my dreams, my feelings about anything that didn't relate to being his elderly mother. I was 78 years old, and I was just beginning to understand that I'd been groomed for this moment. Slowly, carefully, lovingly groomed to hand over everything I'd worked for. And the worst part? I'd fallen for it completely. Because when someone you love tells you they're trying to protect you, you want to believe them. Even when every instinct you have is screaming that something is wrong. Even when you can feel yourself disappearing. One decision at a time. Moving into Daniel and Alicia's house felt like entering a beautiful prison. Their suburban home in Naperville was everything mine wasn't. Granite countertops, hardwood floors that gleamed under recessed lighting, a kitchen island bigger than my entire dining room. It was the kind of house I'd dreamed Daniel might own someday, back when I was working 3 jobs and saving every penny for his future. What I didn't realize was that my money had helped pay for it all. The guest room they'd assigned me was lovely, I suppose. Decorated in soft blues and whites, with a queen bed and a small dresser. Your own little sanctuary, Alicia had said when she showed me around. But sanctuaries were supposed to be places of peace, not captivity. The first week, I tried to settle in gracefully. I unpacked my few belongings, arranged my photographs on the dresser, and attempted to establish a routine. But every routine I tried to create was interrupted, redirected, or criticized. I woke early, as I'd done for 40 years, and tried to make coffee in their pristine kitchen. "Helen," Alicia said, appearing in her silk robe like a disapproving ghost, "you don't need to be up so early. And please don't use the good coffee maker. There's instant in the pantry." The good coffee maker. In my own home, I'd had one coffee maker, a simple Mr. Coffee that had served me faithfully for 15 years. Here, there were apparently good appliances and lesser appliances, and I was meant to know the difference. I tried to help with household tasks, the way I'd always contributed wherever I stayed. But when I offered to do laundry, Alicia looked horrified. "Oh no, Helen. You might mix the colors, or use too much detergent. Best to let me handle it." When I attempted to cook dinner, something I'd done successfully for 7 decades, Daniel gently steered me away from the stove. "Mom, why don't you just relax? You've done enough cooking for one lifetime. Relax." Such a simple word, but it felt like exile. I wasn't relaxing. I was being systematically excluded from every aspect of normal life. By the second week, I understood the real situation. I wasn't a guest, and I wasn't family. I was a problem to be managed. "Helen seems confused about where things go," I heard Alicia tell Daniel one evening, their voices carrying through the thin walls. She put the dishes away wrong, and when I corrected her, she looked so lost. Lost. I'd been putting dishes away for 78 years. But apparently, I was now too confused to understand the difference between a salad plate and a dinner plate. "Maybe we should get her evaluated," Daniel replied. "You know, for memory issues." Memory issues. I was sitting in my room, remembering with perfect clarity every birthday party I'd thrown for him, every school play I'd attended, every night I'd stayed up helping him with homework. My memory was fine. What was failing was my sense of self-worth. The isolation was the worst part. In my own home, I'd had neighbors to chat with. A routine that took me to the grocery store, the bank, the library. Here, I was completely dependent on them for every interaction with the outside world. "I'd like to call Mrs. Kowalski," I said one afternoon, reaching for the phone in the kitchen. "Use the phone in your room," Alicia said quickly. "We're expecting a call." But the phone in my room had been disconnected. "For the renovation," Daniel explained when I asked. "We'll get it fixed soon." Soon became a week, then 2 weeks. My cell phone, which I'd always kept charged and ready, mysteriously stopped working. "Old phones do that," Alicia said with a shrug. "We'll get you a new one when we have time." Time. They had time to go out to dinner twice a week. Time for Alicia's spa appointments. Time for Daniel's golf games. But no time to restore my connection to the outside world. I began to feel like I was disappearing, one small freedom at a time. The day I discovered what they were telling people about me was the day I truly understood the depth of their betrayal. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was sitting in the living room reading a library book, one of the few I'd managed to bring from home, when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see it was Jennifer Walsh, a woman from Daniel's office whom I'd met at the company Christmas party years ago. "I'll get it," Alicia called. But I was already at the door. "Mrs. O'Brien," Jennifer said warmly. "How lovely to see you. I heard you moved in with Daniel and Alicia. How are you adjusting?" Before I could answer, Alicia appeared beside me, her hand firmly on my shoulder. "Hello, Jennifer. Helen's doing well considering." Considering. Such a loaded word. "Mom," Alicia continued, speaking to me like I was a child, "why don't you go rest? You seem tired." I wasn't tired. I was starved for conversation with someone who wasn't monitoring my every word. "Actually," I said, "I'd love to chat with Jennifer. It's been so long since—" "Helen gets confused easily," Alicia interrupted, her grip on my shoulder tightening. "The move has been difficult for her. She sometimes doesn't remember conversations or gets details mixed up." Jennifer's expression shifted from warmth to pity. I watched it happen. The way her eyes softened, the way she began speaking more slowly, more carefully. "Of course," she said. "These transitions can be so hard. It's wonderful that she has you to take care of her." Take care of me. As if I were an invalid, rather than a woman who'd been living independently just months ago. After Jennifer left, I confronted Alicia. "Why did you say I was confused?" "I'm not confused about anything." Her smile was patient, condescending. "Helen, you tried to put the milk in the cabinet yesterday. And last week, you asked me the same question 3 times about dinner plans." The milk incident. I'd been distracted, thinking about a conversation with Daniel. It was the kind of mistake anyone might make. And the dinner question, I'd asked because they kept changing their minds about timing, but in Alicia's retelling, these became evidence of cognitive decline. "I'm not losing my memory," I said firmly. "Of course not, Helen. But you're 78. It's natural for things to slow down a bit. That's why we're here to help." Help, that word again, wielded like a weapon. That evening, I overheard a phone conversation that shattered what was left of my trust. Daniel was in the kitchen, speaking to someone on his cell phone, his voice low but not low enough. "Yeah, she's definitely showing signs," he said. "Alicia's documenting everything. We might need to look into memory care soon." Memory care. A nursing home. "The house money will help with that," he continued. "And once we establish incompetency, we can access more of the savings for her care." Incompetency. They were building a case against me, documenting every small mistake, every moment of confusion that might be used to declare me mentally unfit. I sat in my room that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I'd become the villain in my own story. How had caring for my son become evidence of poor judgment? How had minor mistakes become symptoms of dementia? How had my generosity become proof that I couldn't manage my own affairs? The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. While Alicia was at her yoga class and Daniel was at work, I walked to the mailbox at the end of their driveway. It was the first time I'd been outside alone in weeks. The October air was crisp, the leaves just beginning to turn. For a moment, standing there in the sunshine, I felt like Helen O'Brien again instead of Helen who gets confused easily. I opened the mailbox and found something that made my blood run cold. A statement from First National Bank, my bank. The account with both our names on it. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope. In 6 weeks, they'd spent over $180,000. A new BMW for Alicia, $65,000. Home renovations, $43,000. A vacation to Hawaii I'd never heard them mention, $12,000. Clothes, jewelry, electronics, restaurant bills, spa treatments. Money flowing out like water from a broken dam. My money. My 40 years of sacrifice, being spent on luxuries I'd never allowed myself. At the bottom of the statement, in small print, was a note about a large withdrawal being processed. $200,000, transferred to something called Morrison Investment Holdings. Morrison was Alicia's maiden name. I stood there in the driveway, holding the evidence of my systematic financial destruction, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than confusion or sadness. I felt anger. Pure, clean, clarifying anger. They hadn't just taken my money. They'd taken my dignity, my independence, my reputation. They were telling people I was incompetent while they spent my life savings on luxuries and vacations. And they were planning to lock me away in a nursing home once they'd drained every penny I'd worked for. As I walked back to the house, that bank statement clutched in my hand, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being their victim. It was time to find out exactly what Daniel and Alicia had done with my life, and it was time to fight back. The bank statement burned in my hands like evidence of a crime, which I was beginning to realize it was. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time since I'd signed those papers, I had proof of what they were doing to me, but proof meant nothing if I couldn't act on it. That afternoon, while Alicia was at her weekly nail appointment and Daniel was at work, I did something I hadn't done in months. I made a decision without asking permission. I walked to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and dialed information. "I need the number for First National Bank downtown," I said to the operator, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Helen?" Alicia's voice made me jump. She was standing in the doorway, her keys still in her hand, her expression sharp with suspicion. "What are you doing?" I fumbled for an excuse, but the truth came out instead. "I need to speak to someone at the bank." "About what?" She moved closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume, the kind I'd never been able to afford, now paid for with my own money. "About my account. Our account. I want to understand the statements." Alicia's smile was razor thin. "Helen, we've been through this. Daniel and I handle all the financial matters now. You don't need to worry about—" "I'm not worried," I interrupted, surprising us both with the firmness in my voice. "I'm asking questions. There's a difference." For a moment, something flickered in Alicia's eyes. Surprise, maybe even fear, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Of course you can ask questions," she said, her tone becoming syrupy sweet. "But calling the bank directly will only confuse you more. All those numbers and technical terms. Why don't you sit down, and I'll explain everything." She guided me to the kitchen table with a gentle hand that felt like a cage closing around me. "You see, Helen, managing money is complicated now. It's not like the old days when you could just write checks and balance a checkbook. There are investments, transfers, security protocols." She spoke to me like I was a child learning about money for the first time, not a woman who'd managed her own finances for 4 decades. But as she talked, I noticed something. She was nervous. Her hands moved restlessly, and she kept glancing at the phone. "I'd still like to speak to Mr. Peterson," I said quietly. "Mr. Peterson? Oh, Helen. He's not your banker anymore. When we set up the new account, we were assigned to a different department. Someone who specializes in family financial management." Family financial management. Another euphemism for what they were doing to me. "Then I'd like to speak to whoever is handling our account now." Alicia's smile became strained. I'll call them for you. Tomorrow. When Daniel can be here to help explain everything. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. Always when they could control the conversation, filter the information, manage my access to my own financial life. But that night, something inside me refused to wait for their permission anymore. At 2 a.m., when the house was quiet and I was certain they were asleep, I crept to Daniel's home office. The door was usually locked, but tonight, either through carelessness or providence, it was slightly ajar. Inside, Daniel's desk was neat and organized, just like he'd been as a child. But now, instead of school papers and baseball cards, it held folders labeled with financial terms I didn't recognize and legal documents I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened the first folder. Inside were bank statements going back months, showing transaction after transaction I'd never authorized. But more than that, there were printouts of emails between Daniel and someone named Marcus Chen at Chen Financial Services. The old lady is completely on board, one email read. She signed everything without reading it. Alicia was right. Guilt is a powerful motivator. The old lady. That's how my son referred to me in his business correspondence. Another email made my blood run cold. We need to accelerate the timeline. She's asking more questions lately. Alicia thinks we should consider the incompetency route sooner rather than later. Incompetency route. They had a plan, a strategy, a timeline for destroying my life. I kept reading, each email more devastating than the last. They'd been planning this for over a year, waiting for the right moment to convince me to sign over my money. The cybersecurity threat had been fabricated. The family financial management was a sham. Even the timing of their visits, their expressions of concern about my living alone, it had all been calculated. But the worst discovery was in the bottom drawer, a folder labeled HO Medical. Inside were printouts of articles about dementia, Alzheimer's, age-related cognitive decline. There were handwritten notes in Alicia's careful script. Forgot to turn off stove, 10:3. I'd never forgotten to turn off the stove. Repeated same story twice, 10:7. I'd told Daniel about Mrs. Kowalski's surgery, then mentioned it again days later when he seemed not to remember. Confusion about dates, 10:12. I'd mixed up the day of the week once, the way anyone might. They were building a case against me, documenting every small human mistake as evidence of mental decline. At the bottom of the folder was a business card, Shady Oaks Memory Care Facility. Someone had written in pencil, average cost, $8,000 month, Medicaid eligibility requirements. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were planning to warehouse me in a nursing home and use my own savings to pay for it. I sat in Daniel's chair, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal I'd ever experienced, and felt something I hadn't felt since Robert died. Completely, utterly alone. But then I remembered Mrs. Kowalski's words. This is wrong. Dead wrong. I took pictures of the documents with Daniel's own camera, the expensive digital camera I'd unknowingly bought him with my transfer money. I wasn't sure what I'd do with the evidence, but I knew I needed it. The next morning, I waited until Daniel left for work, then approached Alicia with a calmness that surprised me. I want to visit my house, I said. She looked up from her phone, where she was scrolling through what looked like a shopping website. Your house? My house on Maple Street. I'd like to see how it's being maintained. Her laugh was sharp, dismissive. Helen, we've been through this. The house is being prepared for sale. There's nothing for you to see there. It's still my house until it's sold. Actually, Alicia said, setting down her phone and giving me her full attention, it's not. Daniel had to put it in his name for the sale to go through properly. Tax reasons. The room seemed to tilt. What do you mean? The house is in Daniel's name now. Has been for weeks. Didn't he tell you? He hadn't told me. Of course he hadn't told me. They'd taken my money, my independence, and now my home, and they were treating it like minor administrative details I was too incompetent to understand. I want to see the papers, I said. Helen, you're getting agitated. Maybe you should rest. I'm not agitated. I'm asking to see the legal documents for my own house. Alicia's eyes narrowed. It's not your house anymore, Helen. And frankly, This obsession with paperwork and documents is exactly the kind of thing that worries us about your mental state. Mental state. There it was again. The weapon they used every time I asked questions or expressed concerns about my own life. But this time, instead of backing down, I stood up. I want to call a lawyer. The words hung in the air between us like a declaration of war. Alicia's face went pale, then flushed with anger. A lawyer? Helen, what on earth do you think you need a lawyer for? To understand what's happened to my money, to my house, to my life. Your life is fine, better than fine. You're being taken care of. I'm being controlled. There's a difference. Alicia stood up too, and for the first time, I saw her without the mask of false concern. Her expression was cold, calculating, dangerous. Helen, if you start making wild accusations and bothering lawyers with your confusion, it's only going to prove what we've been worried about, that you're not capable of making rational decisions anymore. Then let me prove I am capable. Let me see my bank statements. Let me speak to my lawyer. Let me visit my house. I think, Alicia said slowly, it's time we had a serious conversation about your living situation. This behavior is concerning, very concerning. The threat was clear. Behave or be locked away. But something had changed in me during those long nights of questioning everything I'd believed about my son's love. I'd spent months feeling crazy, wondering if I was losing my mind, doubting my own perceptions. Now I knew the truth. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being systematically destroyed by people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. Have that conversation, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But have it with me present. And have it with my lawyer present too. Alicia's smile was ice cold. We'll see about that. As she left the room, I heard her on the phone with Daniel, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was telling him. That evening, when Daniel came home, his face was grave. Mom, we need to talk. Yes, I said. We do. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what he might say, because I finally understood that the son I'd raised with such love and sacrifice was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a mother to be honored. The conversation we were about to have would determine whether I spent my remaining years as a victim or found the strength to fight for my dignity. Either way, I was done being silent. The family meeting they called for that Saturday morning felt like a tribunal. Daniel sat across from me at their polished dining room table, his expression a careful mask of concern that I now recognized as performance. Alicia positioned herself beside him, a legal pad in front of her filled with what I assumed were their carefully documented evidence of my declining mental state. But I wasn't the same woman who'd sat in this house weeks ago, confused and apologetic. I had my own documentation now, photographs of their emails, copies of bank statements, and most importantly, a clarity about my situation that burned away the fog of self-doubt they'd spent months creating. Mom, Daniel began, his voice gentle but patronizing. Alicia and I have been talking, and we're concerned about some of your recent behavior. My behavior? I kept my voice level, though my heart was racing. You mean asking questions about my own money? It's not just that, Alicia interjected, consulting her notes like a prosecutor building a case. You've been agitated, paranoid. Yesterday you accused us of stealing from you, which is frankly hurtful after everything we've done to help. Help. That word had lost all meaning. Show me the bank statements, I said simply. Daniel and Alicia exchanged glances. Mom, we've explained this. Show me the statements, or I'm calling the police. The threat hung in the air like electricity before a storm. I'd never spoken to my son this way in his entire life, had never threatened him with anything, but desperation had given me a strength I didn't know I possessed. There's no need for dramatics, Daniel said, but I could see uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. We can review the accounts together if that's what you really want. It is what I want. Alicia left the room and returned with a thin folder. She placed it in front of me with the air of someone humoring a difficult child. Here are the most recent statements. I opened the folder and immediately saw what they were trying to hide. The statements they'd given me showed only the past month, and even those had been edited. Entire pages were missing. Transactions had been redacted or explained away with vague descriptions like household expenses and medical costs. "Where are the complete statements?" I asked, going back to when the account was opened. "Mom, you don't need to see every transaction." "Yes, I do." I stood up, surprising them both. "Because it's my money. Every dollar in that account represents years of my life, hours of my work, sacrifices I made so my son could have a better future. And I want to know exactly where it's gone." "You're being unreasonable," Alicia said, her mask of patience beginning to slip. "We've managed your finances responsibly. Your money is safe. Then show me." "Helen, this obsession with checking and rechecking everything is exactly what we're worried about," Daniel said. "It's not normal behavior. Not normal. Everything they didn't want me to do was labeled as abnormal, confused, concerning. But I was done accepting their version of reality. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photographs I'd taken of their documents. I spread them across the table like playing cards, watching their faces change from condescension to shock to something that might have been fear. $65,000 for a BMW. I read from one of the printed emails. "Did I approve that purchase, Daniel?" His face went pale. "Where did you get those?" $12,000 for a vacation to Hawaii. Was I invited on this vacation that I apparently paid for? "Mom, you don't understand. $200,000 transferred to Morrison Investment Holdings." I looked directly at Alicia. "Morrison is your maiden name, isn't it?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. All the lies, all the manipulation, all the careful gaslighting. It crumbled in the face of simple documentary evidence. "You went through our private papers," Alicia said finally, her voice tight with rage. That's invasion of privacy. That's exactly the kind of erratic behavior we've been documenting. I pulled out another photograph, the folder labeled HO Medical, with their fabricated evidence of my mental decline. "You mean this documentation? The lies you've been writing down to justify stealing from me?" Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the papers. "Mom, this isn't what it looks like. It looks like fraud. It looks like elder abuse. It looks like my son and his wife systematically destroying my life so they could spend my money on luxuries." "We were protecting you," Alicia burst out, abandoning all pretense of concern. "You're 78 years old, Helen. You were going to lose that money anyway. To scammers, to medical bills, to who knows what. At least this way, it's staying in the family." The family. As if their betrayal was an act of love. "And my house?" I asked quietly. Was transferring that to Daniel's name also protecting me? More silence. Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. "We needed collateral for some investments," he said finally. "It was temporary. You were going to put me in a nursing home." I pulled out the business card for Shady Oaks Memory Care. "After you'd spent my money and stolen my house, you were going to warehouse me somewhere and use what was left to pay for it." "It's not like that," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then what is it like?" I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in months. "Explain to me how taking my life savings, lying about my mental health, and planning to institutionalize me is an act of love." Neither of them could answer. "I want my money back," I said. "All of it. And I want my house back in my name." Alicia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "That's impossible. The money's been invested. The house has liens against it. You can't just undo months of financial planning because you're having delusions of persecution." Delusions of persecution. Even now, faced with proof of their crimes, they were trying to make me doubt my own sanity. "Fine," I said, gathering up the photographs. "Then we'll let the police sort it out." "You wouldn't," Daniel said, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "I would. I will. Unless you return every penny you've stolen and transfer my house back to my name, I'm filing charges for elder abuse and fraud." "Mom, please." Daniel's voice cracked. "Think about what you're saying. I'm your son, your only family. If you destroy our relationship over money, you destroyed our relationship when you decided I was worth more to you as a bank account than as a mother." The words hit him like a physical blow. And for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my lap after bad dreams. But that little boy was gone. replaced by a man who'd looked at his elderly mother and seen only opportunity. "If you file charges against us," Alicia said coldly, "we'll have you declared incompetent. We have months of documentation showing your declining mental state. No court will believe your word against ours." It was their final threat, their last weapon, but I was no longer afraid of their lies. "Try it," I said, "because I have something you don't." "What's that?" Daniel asked. "The truth, and help." I'd made a decision that morning before the confrontation. Whatever happened, I wasn't going to face this alone anymore. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Mrs. Kowalski standing on the porch, and beside her, a woman in a business suit I didn't recognize. "That's my lawyer," I said, watching their faces crumble as the reality of their situation hit them. "Sarah Kowalski helped me find her. Turns out, when you're 82 and you've seen what she's seen, you know exactly which lawyers specialize in elder abuse cases." "You can't do this," Alicia whispered. "I already have." As I walked to the door to let in the cavalry I'd summoned, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope that Helen O'Brien, the woman who'd raised a son with bleeding hands, who'd worked 3 jobs and saved every penny, who'd sacrificed everything for love, wasn't gone after all. She'd just been buried under layers of manipulation and lies, waiting for the right moment to fight back. And that moment had finally come. Behind me, I could hear Alicia and Daniel whispering frantically, probably trying to figure out damage control. But it was too late for that. The truth was walking up their front steps, and it was about to set me free. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," I said to the lawyer as I opened the door. "Thank you for coming. I have quite a story to tell you." And for the first time in months, I knew exactly how that story was going to end. The lawyer's name was Margaret Morrison, no relation to Alicia, despite the shared surname, and she had the kind of quiet authority that filled a room without raising her voice. As she settled into Daniel and Alicia's pristine living room, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency, I watched my son and daughter-in-law realize their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Mrs. O'Brien," Margaret said, her voice warm but professional. "Mrs. Kowalski has filled me in on the basics of your situation. I specialize in elder financial abuse cases, and I've brought the proper documentation to begin legal proceedings immediately." Legal proceedings. The words that had terrified me for months now felt like a lifeline. "This is ridiculous," Alicia said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. "Helen is confused. She's been having memory issues, behavioral problems. We have documentation." "Yes, I'd like to see that documentation," Margaret interrupted smoothly, "along with the complete financial records for all accounts containing Mrs. O'Brien's money." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "We don't have to show you anything. This is our home, and Mom is—" "Your mother is my client," Margaret said firmly, "and unless you produce those records voluntarily, I'll be filing for a complete financial audit through the courts, which, I should mention, typically results in frozen assets while the investigation proceeds." The room went silent. I'd never seen Daniel look so small, so cornered. For decades, he'd been the one with the education, the financial knowledge, the authority to make decisions about our family's future. Now he was just a man who'd been caught stealing from his elderly mother. "What exactly are you accusing us of?" Alicia asked, attempting to regain some ground. Margaret pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Based on the evidence Mrs. O'Brien has provided, we have grounds for charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and potentially conspiracy. The pattern of behavior suggests systematic exploitation of a vulnerable adult." "Vulnerable adult?" Daniel's voice cracked. "She's not vulnerable. She's sharp as a tack. She always has been." "Then why?" Margaret asked quietly. "Did you convince her to sign over financial control? Why did you tell people she was having memory problems? Why did you transfer her house to your name without her knowledge?" Each question landed like a physical blow. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water, but his movements were unsteady, defeated. "Look," he said finally, "maybe we made some mistakes. Maybe we should have consulted her more, but we were trying to help." "Help?" I found my voice again. stronger now with Margaret beside me. You spent $65,000 of my money on a car I'm not allowed to drive. You took vacations I wasn't invited on. You transferred $200,000 to an account I don't have access to. That's not help, Daniel. That's theft. We can work this out, Alicia said desperately. Family should handle family problems privately. There's no need to involve the courts. The courts are already involved, Margaret said, pulling out another set of papers. Mrs. O'Brien has filed for emergency financial guardianship of her own accounts. As of this morning, all transactions require her explicit written consent. I watched the color drain from both their faces. What does that mean? Daniel asked. It means, I said, feeling a power I hadn't experienced in months, that you can't spend another penny of my money without my permission. And it means every transaction you've made is being reviewed by a judge. Margaret opened her briefcase again and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I've also prepared a civil suit for recovery of assets. Mrs. O'Brien is seeking full restitution of all funds taken without her consent, plus damages for emotional distress and punitive damages for elder abuse. How much? Alicia whispered. Including interest and penalties? Approximately $1.2 million. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Daniel's face went white. We don't have that kind of money. Then you'll need to liquidate assets, Margaret said matter-of-factly. The BMW, the house improvements, the investments. Everything purchased with Mrs. O'Brien's money will need to be sold to satisfy the judgment. You can't do this! Alicia stood up, her composure finally cracking. Helen, you're destroying your own family over money. Is that what you want? To be completely alone? The question that had terrified me for months no longer held any power. I've been alone for months, I said quietly. Living in this house? I've been lonelier than I ever was in my own home. Because loneliness isn't about being by yourself. It's about being with people who don't see you as human. We love you, Daniel said, tears starting to form in his eyes. Mom, I love you. This whole thing just got out of hand. Love? The word felt foreign in my mouth. When did you last ask me how I was feeling, Daniel? Not how I was managing. Not if I was confused. Not if I needed help with something. When did you last ask me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for the future? He couldn't answer. Love isn't what you take from someone, I continued. It's what you give. And all you've given me for months is criticism, control, and contempt. Margaret cleared her throat. Mrs. O'Brien, there's something else we need to discuss. The living situation. What about it? You have the right to safe housing while this case proceeds. If you feel unsafe or uncomfortable here, I can arrange temporary accommodation. The offer hung in the air like a key to a prison cell. I could leave. I could walk away from this beautiful house that had become my cage. From the son who'd become my captor, from the life that had slowly been strangling me. Where would I go? I asked. I have a small apartment above my garage, Mrs. Kowalski said from the doorway, where she'd been quietly observing. It's not fancy, but it's yours for as long as you need it, and it comes with a friend who actually enjoys your company. The kindness in her voice nearly broke me. After months of being treated like a burden, someone was offering me not just shelter, but friendship. I'd like that, I said. You can't leave, Alicia said desperately. Helen, you need supervision. You need help with medications, with meals, with what? I interrupted. I managed my medications for 78 years before you decided I was incompetent. I cooked for myself and my son for decades before you decided I was too confused to use a stove. I paid my bills, maintained my house, lived independently for 40 years after my husband died. The only thing I can't manage is living with people who lie to me. Margaret began packing her papers. Mrs. O'Brien, I'll need you to come to my office tomorrow to sign some additional documents. We'll also need to visit the bank to restore your account access and review all transactions. What about us? Daniel asked. What happens to us? That depends, Margaret said, on how cooperative you are in returning Mrs. O'Brien's assets. Full cooperation might result in civil resolution. Continued resistance will result in criminal charges. Criminal charges. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd gone from successful financial advisor to potential felon in the span of a single afternoon. "Mom," he said as I stood to leave, "please don't do this. Think about what you're throwing away. Think about your grandchildren. Think about the family." I paused at the door and looked back at him. This man who'd once been the center of my world, who I'd sacrificed everything for, who'd repaid my love with calculated cruelty. "I thought about family every day for 78 years, I said. "I thought about it when I worked 3 jobs to pay for your education. I thought about it when I gave you the down payment for this house. I thought about it when I trusted you with my life savings. And you know what I realized?" He waited. "Family isn't about blood. It's about respect. It's about seeing each other as human beings worthy of dignity and love. And you stopped seeing me as family the moment you looked at me and saw only a bank account." As I walked out of that house for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Lightness. Not the lightness of relief, but the lightness of a bird that had finally remembered how to fly. Behind me, I could hear Alicia crying and Daniel making phone calls, probably to lawyers, accountants, anyone who might help them salvage their situation. But their crisis was no longer my crisis. Their panic was no longer my responsibility. I was 78 years old, and I was finally free. Mrs. Kowalski's apartment above her garage was small but bright, with windows that looked out over a garden she tended with loving care. It had a kitchenette where I could make my own coffee, a comfortable bed where I could sleep without fear of midnight check-ins on my mental state, and most importantly, a lock on the door that only I controlled. That first night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I wasn't walking on eggshells, afraid that any small mistake would be used as evidence against me. I was just Helen O'Brien, watching the day end and the night begin, making my own choices about my own life. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough. 6 months later, I stood in the departure lounge at O'Hare International Airport, holding a one-way ticket to Rome with hands that no longer shook from fear, but trembled with excitement. The legal proceedings had moved faster than Margaret had predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of criminal charges, Daniel and Alicia had agreed to full restitution. The BMW was sold, their house was refinanced, and slowly, painfully for them, my money was returned. Not all of it. Some had been lost in failed investments, some spent on luxuries that couldn't be recovered, but enough came back to restore my independence and fund the dream I'd never allowed myself to pursue. Travel. Real travel, not the weekend trips to nearby states that had been the extent of my adventures. For 78 years, I dreamed of seeing the world, but had always put others' needs first. Now, with my freedom restored and my dignity intact, I was finally going to live for myself. The woman sitting next to me in the gate area was reading a romance novel, and I smiled at the irony. At 78, I was about to embark on the greatest love affair of my life, a romance with the world itself, with possibility, with the Helen O'Brien who'd been buried under decades of duty and sacrifice. Mrs. Kowalski had driven me to the airport, insisting she wasn't too old to navigate Chicago traffic, despite being 4 years my senior. "You call me from every city," she'd said as we hugged goodbye at security. "I want to live vicariously through your adventures." Adventures. The word felt foreign but thrilling on my tongue. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart clenched, wondering if Daniel was trying to contact me again. In the months since I'd left his house, he'd attempted to reach out several times. Apologies mixed with justifications, explanations that somehow always ended up being my fault for misunderstanding their intentions. But the message was from Margaret Morrison. "Settlement finalized. Remaining funds transferred to your account. Enjoy Italy, Helen. You've earned it. $732,000. Not the full amount I'd started with, but more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. More importantly, it was mine again. Truly mine. With no one else's name on the accounts. No one else's permission required for any transaction." The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, and I gathered my single carry-on bag. Everything I needed for this new chapter of my life fit in one small suitcase. Amazing how little you actually need when you're not carrying the weight of other people's expectations. As the plane lifted off from Chicago, I pressed my face to the window and watched the city grow smaller below me. Somewhere down there was the house on Maple Street where I'd raised Daniel, where I'd learned to be strong after Robert died, where I'd made a million small sacrifices that had somehow added up to losing myself completely. Somewhere down there was the suburban house where I'd been systematically destroyed and rebuilt, where I'd learned the difference between being loved and being used, where I'd discovered that sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. But those places were part of my past now. Below me, the landscape changed from urban sprawl to farmland to wilderness, and with each mile, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I'd been in years. The flight to Rome took 9 hours, but it felt like a journey through time as well as space. I dozed, I read, I talked to the Italian businessman sitting beside me who told me about his favorite restaurants in Trastevere. When I mentioned it was my first trip to Italy, his eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved secret. "Signora," he said, "you are going to fall in love. Roma? She captures the heart and never lets go. Fall in love." At 78, I was ready to fall in love again, with places, with experiences, with the woman I was becoming. The apartment I'd rented through an agency was in a converted palazzo near the Spanish Steps, with tall windows that opened onto a small balcony overlooking cobblestone streets. It was tiny by American standards, but perfect for my needs. A comfortable bed, a small kitchen, and that magical balcony where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch Rome wake up around me. My first week was spent simply existing in this new space, learning the rhythm of Italian days. I discovered the corner bakery where the owner, Signora Benedetti, patiently helped me practice my rusty Italian while selecting fresh bread each morning. I found the tiny grocery store where the produce was so fresh it seemed to glow, run by a family who adopted me as their nonna Americana within days. I walked. God, how I walked. Through the Forum, imagining the voices of ancient Romans echoing off the stones. Through the Vatican museums, overwhelmed by the beauty humans could create when inspired. Through Trastevere at sunset, when the golden light made every building look like a painting. My legs, weakened by months of enforced inactivity in Daniel's house, grew strong again. My appetite, suppressed by stress and control, returned with a vengeance. I ate gelato for breakfast because I could, drank wine with lunch because it felt Italian, stayed up past midnight in sidewalk cafes because no one was monitoring my sleep schedule. 3 weeks into my Roman adventure, something magical happened. I was sitting in my favorite cafe struggling to read an Italian newspaper with my phrase book, when a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, but are you Helen?" I turned to find a woman about my age, with silver hair and kind eyes, speaking English with a slight British accent. "I'm Helen," I said, confused. "Do we know each other?" She smiled. "Not exactly. But I've been hearing about the American grandmother who's been charming all the shopkeepers in the neighborhood. I'm Diana. I live just down the street, and I wondered if you'd like some company for dinner tonight." Diana, it turned out, was a retired English teacher from London who'd moved to Rome 5 years earlier after her husband died. She understood the journey I was on, the rediscovery of self after decades of definition through others, the intoxicating freedom of making choices based solely on personal desire. I spent 40 years making decisions based on what was best for my family, my students, my community, she told me over dinner that first evening. It took me until I was 73 to realize I'd never once asked myself what I actually wanted. We became fast friends, then traveling companions. Diana introduced me to her circle of expatriate women, Americans, Brits, Australians, all of us refugees from lives that had somehow become too small for our dreams. We took day trips to hill towns, explored museums together, shared stories of the journeys that had brought us to this unexpected chapter of our lives. For the first time since Robert died 40 years earlier, I felt part of a community where I was valued not for what I could provide, but for who I was. 2 months into my Italian sojourn, I received an email that stopped me cold. It was from someone named Jennifer Walsh at the Chicago Tribune, a journalist who'd heard about my case through Margaret Morrison's law firm. Mrs. O'Brien, the email read, I'm writing a series about elder financial abuse, and your attorney suggested you might be willing to share your story. I believe your experience could help other families recognize the warning signs and prevent similar situations. Share my story. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. For months, I'd felt ashamed of what had happened to me, as if being victimized was somehow my fault. But sitting in my Roman apartment, looking out at the eternal city where civilizations had risen and fallen and been reborn countless times, I realized that shame had no place in my new life. I wrote back that evening, agreeing to the interview. The story ran 3 months later as a front-page feature in the Tribune's Sunday edition. The Invisible Victim: How Financial Elder Abuse Hides in Plain Sight. Jennifer had captured not just the facts of my case, but the emotional journey from victim to survivor to woman reborn. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from adult children horrified at seeing their own behavior reflected in Daniel's actions. From elderly parents who recognized their own situations in mine. From financial advisors, social workers, and attorneys who wanted to use my story to educate others about the warning signs. But the letter that moved me most came from a 76-year-old woman in Phoenix named Carol. Helen, I read your story and realized my daughter has been doing the same things to me. I've been making excuses, telling myself she's just trying to help. But after reading about your experience, I found the courage to ask questions. I discovered she'd taken almost $200,000 from my accounts. I've contacted a lawyer, and I wanted to thank you for showing me that it's never too late to fight back. Never too late to fight back. Those words became my motto, my mission, my message to the world. 6 months after the Tribune story ran, I received a call from the National Center on Elder Abuse. They were organizing a conference on financial exploitation and wanted me to be a keynote speaker. Mrs. O'Brien, the coordinator said, your story has inspired legislation in 3 states. Senators are quoting your case in committee hearings. You've become a voice for thousands of victims who thought they were alone. A voice. At 78, I'd found my voice in the most unexpected way. Not through years of preparation or professional expertise, but through survival. Through the simple act of refusing to disappear quietly. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., and as I stood at the podium looking out at an audience of advocates, attorneys, social workers, and survivors, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made transform into something powerful and purposeful. My name is Helen O'Brien, I began, and for most of my life, I was invisible. I was the widow who worked 3 jobs, the mother who sacrificed everything, the elderly woman who was supposed to be grateful for any attention at all. But I learned something important. Being invisible is a choice, and I choose to be seen. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but the real reward came afterward, when woman after woman approached me to share their own stories, to thank me for giving them permission to value themselves, to fight back, to refuse to disappear. Now, as I write this from my little apartment in Rome, my permanent home, not just a vacation, I can see the Spanish Steps from my balcony, where tourists climb up and down all day, each one on their own journey to somewhere new. I am 79 years old, and I am just beginning. Yesterday, I enrolled in an Italian cooking class. Next month, Diana and I are traveling to Sicily. In the spring, I'm thinking about learning to paint. Not because I need to be productive, but because I want to see if I can capture the light that falls across the Tiber at sunset. I think about Daniel sometimes. Wonder if he's learned anything from losing me. I hope he has, for his own sake. But his journey is no longer my responsibility. I spent 78 years being responsible for other people's happiness, other people's success, other people's lives. Now I'm responsible for my own joy, and I'm discovering that it's the most liberating responsibility of all. To anyone listening to this story who sees themselves in my experience, I want you to know, it's not too late. It's never too late to choose yourself, to demand respect, to refuse to be invisible. The world is wide and full of possibilities, and you deserve to explore every one of them. Have you ever felt like you've lost yourself in taking care of others, or known someone who has? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Because these stories need to be told, and someone out there needs to hear that they're not alone. Arrivederci from Rome, where even at 79, life is just beginning.